Morning everyone. In this video I'm going to show you how to make a watercolour wash. We're going to have a look at what that means, we're going to have a look at the different ways of doing it, and though these may seem like very simple techniques, as you progress with your watercolour painting you'll see that these skills and techniques underpin everything that you do, no matter how experienced or competent you are. So using the equipment that I showed you in the last video, we're going to paint a number of different washes. We're going to look at flat washes, we'll have a look at painting a graded wash, we'll have a look at a variegated wash. I'll show you how we paint those wet on dry, and I'll also show you how we paint them wet on wet. And if you stay tuned to the end, I will show you another type of wash. It's a really useful skill to develop and will give you a lot of flexibility and a lot of options as you start to progress with your landscape painting. So let's get straight into it. What I've done is I've prepared my paper. I'll show you that and do the same too, and then hopefully you can use this to sort of paint along when you've got the video next to you, and that might help you to learn some of these techniques and start to become more familiar and more capable at executing them. Okay, so I'm using the same equipment that I mentioned in the previous video that I did on basic watercolour equipment to get started. You're going to need a nice large brush. I've got a size 12 here, and I have my aquafine paints, got some water. The board here is at an angle. That's important because having it at an angle, and it's not a particularly steep one, but it's just enough to allow the paint to run down the paper. And as you'll see, we control that and work with that as part of the process of making these washes. The first thing I'm going to do is paint a flat wash, and I'm painting this wet onto dry. Wet paint, dry paper. It's called a flat wash just because the colour is flat. It shouldn't change throughout this shape here that I'm going to paint. So let's mix up some colour. Why don't we start with a nice yellow like gamboge. That's perfect. Now you need to make sure you've got enough paint to cover this square because you don't want to run out halfway through and have to mix some more. So I'm just going to get a bit more water in here. A little bit more paint, and that should be plenty. And load your brush up with lots of paint and start at the top and simply make a stroke from right to left, left to right, it doesn't really matter. As you can see, the gradient of the board is allowing the paint to run down the paper, and I'm getting a nice little bead at the bottom here. That's important. If you don't get that, you're painting too dry. I'll pick up a little bit more paint, and then I start at this side and come back. There's plenty of paint here. I can keep going, picking up that bead and working down the paper from top to bottom. Just getting a little bit too dry there, so let's pick up some more paint and keep going. And because I've mixed this paint before starting on this area, I don't need to worry about mixing more. I've got enough here. And that means that I'm going to be able to achieve a flat, uniform wash in this shape. See the bead that's still there? And bring it down to the bottom of the square here. And there we are. I've created a flat wash. The colour is lovely and uniform. That's because I've been using plenty of wet paint and I've been working methodically down the paper. I haven't been going back up into this area and messing around with it. That is fraught with problems. And I've done other videos that cover those problems and how to avoid them. I will put links to those in this video description. Check them out, have a look at them, and that will give you a little bit more context to that particular comment. The next wash I'm going to do is called a graded wash, and I'm still going to be using just one colour, but it's going to start dark at the top and become lighter by the time we get to the bottom. Let's have a different colour. Let's have an orange or something like that this time. There we are, lovely. Now I don't need to mix quite as much paint when I'm going to do this wash, because I'm going to add water to this to dilute it as we go down the paper. Same as previous, we start at the top, a lovely juicy band of orange paint there. You need to make sure that this edge here that you are working with remains nice and wet, because you're now going to get some more water and mix it into here. More water still. Let's keep diluting this colour. More water. And now this is becoming very dilute as I get towards the bottom of this shape. To the point, my last few strokes along the bottom here are almost clear water. In fact, I'm just going to run some clear water along the bottom there. And there we have a nice graded wash. There's a smooth transition from darker tone at the top to a much lighter tone of the same colour at the bottom. And that is simply achieved by adding more water as we work down the paper. With watercolour, that's how you lighten the paint that you're working with. We don't have white, that just makes it more opaque. In order to lighten the colour that you're using, you add more water. It makes it more transparent. It allows the white of the paper to shine through, and hence we get this nice gradual reduction in tone from top to bottom. Now I'm going to paint a variegated wash, and by that I mean a wash that changes from one colour to another within the confines of this shape. Let's have some blue. So let's start off with some blue. Cobalt blue here. Really nice colour. Nice sort of medium to cool blue. Sure, we've got plenty of that. So let's start off with blue, and again we just work very simply across the page, allowing the angle of the board to bring the paint down. Now I'm just going to add a little bit more water, and I'm going to go into, I don't know, one of these reds here, and mix that in with the blue. Pick up your blue, continue to come down the paper. A little bit more water, not too much, but a bit more red. I'm adding a bit more water because I keep on adding pigment here, and I want the tone of this, i.e. the darkness, to be roughly the same throughout. And if I'm adding more pigment, that will be making it tonally darker. So that's why I just keep adding a little bit more water each time. Not too much though. More red, and you can see we're moving from that nice cobalt blue colour at the top through to purple, And as we come towards the bottom of the paper here, it's becoming quite pink. And there we have a lovely smooth transition from blue to red through purple. That's called a variegated wash. So all three of these are painted wet onto dry, wet paint on dry paper. Being able to paint a nice smooth flat wash is so important. It comes up all the time when you are painting landscapes, as does a graded wash, often very useful for clear blue skies where it's a lot darker at the top and moves into a paler blue as you get towards the horizon. Variegated washes also excellent for skies where the sky is blue at the top and it may become slightly warmer as you come towards the horizon, as is often the case. And no matter what you're painting within your landscape, inevitably you are going to need to use these three techniques in some form or another throughout your painting. I've shown you those three washes painted wet onto dry, and now I'm going to show you how to do the same washes, but this time painting wet on wet. What that means is that instead of painting on dry paper, I will wet the paper first, just using clear water, and then I will paint into that. First of all, I'm going to paint this square here just with clear water. I say it's clear, it's got a little bit orange, but that's not a bad thing because it helps you just to see that on the paper. There we are, and I'm just going to let that dry ever so slightly. I don't want it to go so that it's sort of non-shiny but just a bit damp. I still want it to be wet. There, that's probably okay now. Let's pick up some of this yellow. I think some of the orange has run into it. And because I'm painting into a wet area here, it is going to have the effect of diluting the paint more than it is on the palette. So let's get a reasonably strong mix there, and we'll go into the water. And you'll see this time that instead of having a well-defined bar across the top that we had last time, it just won't stay where I've put it. It runs down the paper, it gets a little bit out of control. But it also goes on a little easier. You can see I can just move this colour around a little bit easier. Because this area here is wet, it's all blending and running together rather nicely. In many ways, making it a little bit easier than painting wet onto dry. There you see, I've done that a lot quicker, and I haven't had to be so concerned about picking up that bead very quickly as I work down the paper. There isn't one. Because this area is wet, the pigment goes into it, it runs out into that particular shape that's defined by the clear water that I painted earlier. And you arrive at a shape with a flat wash considerably quicker than we did there. Let's see what happens when we do a graded wash next to it. Again, paint this area with clear water. And this time my approach to painting this is going to be slightly different. Here, I kept on adding more dilute paint as I worked down towards the bottom here. I've already got some water here that is going to aid the process of diluting my paint. So I will just approach this in a slightly different way. Let's get some more orange. And I'm going to start at the top. And I'm just going to keep coming down now because as I do this, there's less and less pigment in the brush. It is becoming more dilute as it runs into the water. making it naturally a lot lighter. And I can do this all the way down to the bottom. I might rinse it out, just get a tiny amount more orange just to aid the effect. And I can move that all the way down to the bottom of this shape. Again, this was achieved much quicker than we did here. And if you're asking, well, why would I do it this way as opposed to this way? What would be the circumstances whereby I'd want to use wet on wet as opposed to wet on dry? Well, certainly in large areas like skies where you don't have a lot of time to paint a larger area because the paint dries quickly, by wetting the whole area and then dropping in the colours, you have more time to work. What you're doing is taking place quicker. The water that is already on your paper is allowing colours to run, merge and blend in a way that doesn't happen quite as easily when you're painting wet and dry. The downside to it, of course, is that there's less control over what you're doing. And that's okay, providing you're happy to see what's going on, work with it, and understand what you can do to control it. But that's something else for us to look at in another video. In fact, my video called Controlling the Wash gives you quite a bit more information on that, so have a look at it. Now let's move on to the variegated wash. Again, wet the area first. And I'm almost doing two separate graded washes here in two different colours and allowing this to merge in the middle. I'll show you what I mean. Let's start with the blue. Stronger blue at the top. And again, work down, take a bit of the pigment out of the brush, allow that to come down like we did with the graded wash. And then pick up some of that nice red colour. And while this is still wet, I want it reasonably dilute, I can go into here and back up into that blue because this is all still very wet. Come over the top, I can add more red. I'm almost doing an upside down graded wash of red on top of the blue. And there I have a similar result, but I've allowed the water here to do the blending for me. Blue went on first, almost like a graded wash. Then I painted the red while it was still wet and got increasingly strong as I came down to the bottom, so almost like an inverted graded wash. And because the paper's wet, very wet I should say, because once it gets damp you might have problems with this technique, I can just allow these colours to run together. So with wet on dry you have more control over what you're doing. However, the technique of being able to grade and to blend and to get uniformity as well is a little more tricky. With wet on wet you have less control over what you're doing. The paint is flowing into the wet space on the paper, and that can be quite intimidating, and it can be a more difficult technique when you're learning how to paint with watercolour. The benefit though is that the blending is often smoother and quicker, and you can achieve some lovely effects through doing it, and is particularly useful when you need to cover large areas of paper with a range of different colours or tones. You've now seen a flat wash, a graded wash, a variegated wash painted wet onto dry. You've also seen those painted wet on wet. Now you'll see that when I made those washes, they're painted in simple squares. And of course, as you start to make landscape paintings, you'll realise that you very rarely paint squares. Of course, the scene that you're painting is made up of washes of all different shapes and sizes. Sometimes the shape that you need to paint is very irregular, and it's still a wash. The term wash doesn't really define anything more than an area that you paint in your painting. It could just be a boat, a tree, a field, all the sky, a large area of sea. It doesn't really matter. But particularly as you start doing subjects like trees, woodlands, rocks, cliff faces, meadows, this type of thing, the shapes that you're having to paint are very irregular. And what I'm going to show you now is something called a broken wash. My paintings are full of broken washes that I use to describe certain areas, often areas that have some texture or some detail that I just simply want to suggest as opposed to spell out or state explicitly. Painting a broken wash requires a different approach in terms of your brush strokes and in terms of the amount of paint that you have on the brush. So let me show you how I do that. You can practice it too. And don't be discouraged by the fact that your first attempts are not going to work as well perhaps as mine did, because I've been there, believe me. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, I will still paint an area and think, oh, I didn't quite get that broken area as I wanted to. I would have liked a slightly more ragged edge to it, and I just didn't execute it very well. Don't be discouraged. Keep practicing it, and you will start to find a way of making this work. And it's in your experimentation and your observation and noticing how much pressure you're putting on the brush that you'll start to progress. You need to feel that for yourself. I can't tell you that. There's no way of quantifying it or really describing it. I can give you a few tips and a few clues. I can make some simple demonstrations, but ultimately you've got to do it for yourself and keep doing it until you get into a groove whereby you're starting to see results that you're more comfortable with. What I've got here is some Langton paper still, but this is the rough surface. I just wanted to show you that because the surface texture is very conducive for painting broken washes and achieving the type of brush strokes and effects that I want to show you. And what I've done is I've mixed up two pools of colour here on the palette, and I've got a sort of warm bluey grey here, and I'm just going to start off by painting imagining some distant hills here. Now you'll see that what I'm going to do is just change up the colour. I'm going to go into this green colour because I'm imagining that the sun is catching the distant hills in places too. So I don't want it all to be exactly the same blue all the way across. These two running together, it's a variegated wash, as I showed you previously. Here's a sort of painting or real life example of that. And let's go back into the blue. There can be some shadow here. Now, did you see what I did with my brush there? I flicked it quickly across the surface of the paper. In doing that, it's created this broken edge along the bottom here. That could be anything. It could be distant buildings, for example. Let's keep working down the paper here. And what I'm going to do is introduce another colour now, let's use some burnt sienna. Just warms this green up quite nicely. And again, I've got a broken edge happening here. It's still all the same shape. All this is connected together. But let's imagine we're coming down now into areas of field, and I'm allowing the brush to skip quickly across this rough paper, and it's giving me broken edges. It's a broken wash. And this starts to describe texture in the fields, for example. Let's pick up a bit more raw sienna, a bit more blue. Go back to a nice green here. It's still all one shape. It's a variegated wash with these different colours in it. But I'm introducing different textures. I'm achieving these broken edges here. And I can do that also by taking out a little bit of the pigment, holding the brush flat on the paper, and skimming lightly over the surface of this rough paper. It gives me these lovely textures. This can be anything in the foreground here. It could be long grass, it could be a hedgerow, anything like that. And you see, when this is dry, I can glaze over the top of this with another pale wash. I'll show you that in a minute. And we have quite a nice effect. This is all one shape still. It's just all connected together. And it is a tremendously useful skill to have, because it enables you very quickly and simply to describe areas of texture and detail within a landscape. I'm just going to let all that dry, and then I'll put a glaze over and show that we can create a very, very simple, quick landscape with the most basic of washes. Now that this has completely dried, I'm going to put a wet on wet glaze over the top of it. And that'll give you some ideas of how you can use wet on wet techniques in your painting. Here, what you have painted first must be completely dry. So I'm just going to put some water over the top of this very gently. Don't scrub this on, just lay it on nice and soft. Perfect. I'm just going to drop in some nice sunlit green here. This is raw sienna and Prussian blue. Just drop that into that white area there, perhaps some there. Again, be very careful when you're doing this. Don't scrub the paint on here, just drop it in. This is the beauty of working wet into wet. What's happening here is the water that's already on the paper is almost acting like your brush. It's moving the paint around for you. You're just putting it roughly where you want it to go and allowing the paint and the water to do their own thing. As I was putting the water on, I left a broken brush stroke here, so just drop some colour into there, because that will give you some nice, interesting texture there in the foreground. And I think I might just put a little raw sienna across here where we thought they could be houses. That's not raw sienna, that's green, so let's just take that out with the brush. But that doesn't matter, it's in the distance there, so that's fine. Perhaps mix up some darker green and just drop that in places in the foreground too. Adds a little bit of variety to your painting. And so what I've done here is create a very, very simple landscape just out of 2 washes. The first was a variegated wash. You saw how that I changed the colour up from blue into a little bit of green where the sun's catching the hills there. We came down into this sort of muddy green colour, added in some burnt sienna as we came down, and I let that dry. The way I was allowing my brush to work with the rough texture of the paper has created a broken wash. These edges aren't straight, they're jagged and suggest detail and suggest texture, and they create a really, really nice effect. All of this was one wash and it was just allowed to run together. I let that dry. I've put a glaze of clear water very carefully over the top and dropped areas of colour in, wet into wet, and allowed them to run out on top of what I'd painted previously. It has the effect of softening it slightly, and so with 2 simple washes, there we are. We have a very, very simple landscape. Well, thanks so much for watching the tutorial. I hope you found that helpful, and practice these little exercises because they are the building blocks that you need to go on to make landscape paintings. They will be difficult initially. Don't be put off by that. Watercolour is a challenging medium and it requires dedication and practice to achieve the results that you want. If you've liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you've subscribed, thanks ever so much for doing that. If not, please click on the subscribe button, also the little bell icon there. If you click on that, it'll notify you each time I post a new tutorial. And next time round, what I'm going to show you is how to mix colours. Understanding colour mixing is extremely important for landscape painting, and I will show you some techniques that will help you with that. I'll also show you some of the colours that I use and how to set out a palette that will enable you to find those colours easily and mix the colours that you want with accuracy and precision. In the meantime, happy painting, thanks for watching again, and I'll see you next time.